Hello everyone, I am here today to discuss the topic that was assigned to me, which is bimanual coordination skills and catching a moving object. Bimanual coordination is a motor skill that requires the simultaneous use of the two arms. The skill may require the two arms to move with the same or different spatial and/or temporal characteristics. There are two kinds of bimanual coordination, symmetric and asymmetric. When we say symmetric bimanual coordination, it is when sometimes the two limbs or two hands do essentially the same thing. This occurs when someone rows a boat or when a person in a wheelchair rolls the wheels of the chair in order to go straight forward or backward. Another example of this is jumping a rope. On the other hand, asymmetric bimanual coordination is when each limb does something different. For example, a guitar player holds strings with one hand to determine chords, while plucking or striking strings with the other hand to produce sound. But the question about the performance of bimanual coordination skills is, why is it more difficult to perform skills that require asymmetric than symmetric bimanual coordination? Like for example, why do we find it difficult to rub our stomach with one hand while at the same time tapping the top of our head with the other hand? The answer to this question is based on an important characteristic of the motor control system: its inherent preferences for controlling limb movements. It prefers symmetry. For the two arms, this means that the two limbs prefer to the same thing at the same time. These preferences help the performance of symmetric bimanual skills, but can lead to problems for asymmetric skills. The bimanual coordination tasks describe that the more difficult of the two aiming tasks influence the performance of the arm doing the less difficult task. That is, the arm that was required to move a shorter distance slowed down in comparison to when it moved the same distance alone. The example of this is the task used in an experiment of Swinen et al. 1990, when the participants required to rapidly move their arms in different spatial temporal patterns. The task involved moving one arm in a simple one-direction arm flexion movement, while at the same time moving the other in a two-part flexion and extension movement. Researchers are not certain how bimanual coordination is controlled. However, we know that the two arms are coupled into coordinative structure that prefers spatial temporal symmetry. An in-phase relationship between the arms appears to be the predominant symmetrical pattern. In addition, we know that with practice, a person can learn to uncouple or dissociate the two limbs and simultaneously move his or her arms asymmetrically, but we do not yet understand the control mechanism involved in this dissociation process. Some researchers report evidence that proprioceptive feedback is important in this process. Proprioceptive feedback entails the physical interaction with our environments that allow humans to build a sense of where their body begins and ends in space, even without vision. An example of proprioception is when you blindfold yourself and try to find your nose. While others propose that visual feedback is the basis for performing the complex asymmetric bimanual coordination, the use of visual feedback can help to ensure consistent motor output. Catching an object is like the prehension action that Jefferson discussed earlier. However, there are two important differences. First, catching involves intercepting a moving object, while prehension typically involves a stationary object. Second, the grasp of the object in the catching action ends the action, while prehension typically involves doing something with the grasped object. Although in some sports situations, such as baseball and softball, there are occasions in which a player must remove the ball from the glove after the catch and throw the ball. To catch an object, the person must first move the arm and hand toward the oncoming object. Then, he or she must shape the hand to catch the object. Finally, the fingers must grasp the object. In the first phase, movement can be initiated from a variety of positions. To attain a position, we start at one and end in another. The postures from which the movement is initiated are known as starting positions. These can either be active or passive in nature. In the second phase, the major function of the human hand is to manipulate objects to accomplish a goal. The ability of a human hand to assure a myriad of position and to apply only the precise amount of pressure necessary to hold an object is due to the mobility and stability supplied by the skeleton and the power of the muscle. In the third phase, the sensory feedback is used to assess the shape, size, texture, and weight of the object. The feedback used in both grasping and lifting of an object is dependent on the brain interpreting correctly what is seen on the hand responding appropriately. Williams and McCreary 1988 provided research evidence demonstrating the basis of catching with their study of 11-year-old boys trying to catch a ball with one hand. If we analyze the movement in the figure, there was no arm motion for the first 160 to 240 milliseconds of the ball flight. Then elbow flexion gradually began and continued slowly and uniformly for about 80% of the ball flight. At about the same time, the fingers began to extend. The hand began to withdraw from the oncoming ball until about one half of the ball flight time had elapsed. Then the upper arm accelerated about the shoulder, which resulted in the hands being transported to the spatial position required for intercepting the ball. Boys who caught the ball began final positioning action 80 milliseconds earlier than boys who failed to catch it. By the time 75% of the ball flight was complete, 130 milliseconds prior to contact, each successful boy had his hand and fingers in a ready state for catching the ball. These results indicate that vision provides advanced information enabling the motor control system to spatially and temporally set the arms, hands, and fingers before the ball arrives so that the individual can catch the ball. The person bases the grasping action on visual information obtained before the ball actually makes contact with the hand, rather than on feedback obtained after the ball has hit the hand. Research evidence also shows that both central and peripheral vision operate when a person picks up information critical to catching an object. Catching an object, such as a ball, is a complex perception action skill that has challenged researchers in their efforts to understand how the visual and motor control systems interact. The results of these research efforts have identified several factors that influence successful catching, which relate specifically to the visual observation of the object. One factor is the amount of time of visual contact with the moving object. Research evidence indicates that constant visual contact is needed during two critical periods of time in the object's flight: the initial part of the flight and the period of time just prior to contact with the hands. Some researchers have reported evidence indicating that observation of the initial flight should continue until the ball reaches its zenith, although others have indicated that only the first 300 milliseconds of flight are important. The important point here is that visual contact with the object is needed for an amount of time during its initial flight phase that is sufficient to obtain information to determine estimates of the direction and distance of the flight. In terms of visual contact with the object during its final portion of flight, research evidence indicates that the time period between 200 and 300 milliseconds before hand contact is critical for successful catching, although the precise amount of time may depend on the specific characteristics of the situation, especially the length of time the object is in flight and its velocity. The need to see the ball during the final portion of its flight is to obtain specific time to contact information for the final spatial positioning of the hand and fingers, and the timing of the closing of the fingers during the grasp of the object. In the research by Elliott and his colleagues indicates that continuous visual contact with the ball during this period of time is not essential. The Elliott et al. 1994 study showed that people can catch a ball that has flight time of 1 second by intermittently seeing brief snapshots, approximately 20 milliseconds of the ball every 80 milliseconds of its flight. Thus, people can use visual samples of ball flight characteristics to obtain the information they need to catch the ball. A significant amount of research evidence indicates that tau is involved in solving the time to contact problem when catching an object, although tau alone does not appear to be sufficient to explain vision's role in catching. Tau means time to closure of a motion gap. In this case, the distance between the ball and the target at its current closure rate provides powerful information for timing movement. When an object moves directly toward the person, the projected size of the object on the retina expands at a non-linear rate as the object approaches. The object expands more slowly when the object is farther away, but increases its rate of expansion as it gets closer. It is this rate of expansion of angular size, which is often referred to as looming, that the visual system uses to determine when collision of the object with the person will occur. For the action of catching, this optical expansion establishes when the movement must be initiated and how quickly it must be completed to catch the object. For objects that do not move directly toward the person but require the person to run to catch them, tau also provides the visual basis for timing the catch, although the mathematics for calculating tau are distinctly more complex. In the experiment of Smith and Marriott 1982, they attached a screen to the participants so they could see the oncoming ball but not their hands. When the participants were able to see their hands, they averaged 17.5 catches out of 20 balls thrown. However, when they could not see their hands, they were able to catch an average of 9.2 balls out of 20. More important, when they could not see their hands, participants typically made a hand positioning error. They could not get their hands into the correct spatial position to intercept the ball. But when they could see their hands, their typical errors involved grasping. They initiated too early the finger flexion they needed to grasp the ball. This explained that experience is an important factor influencing a person's catching success when he or she cannot see his or her hands. Fishman and Schneider 1985 provided empirical evidence that supports the influence of experience. Using the same experimental procedures as those of Smith and Marriott, they included participants who had at least 5 years experience in varsity baseball or softball. The results of this experiment show that although the number of catches decreased when the experienced people could not see their hands, the type of error did not depend on whether or not participants could see their hands. However, for the inexperienced ball catchers, more positioning errors than grasp errors occurred when they could not see their hands. Researchers now generally agree that both ball catching experience and skill level influence the need for a person to see his or her hands while catching a ball. In the figure, you can see the differences of an experienced and non-experienced person in catching a ball. More experienced and skilled catchers do not need to see their hands. Less experienced and low-skilled catchers require vision of their hands. The reason for these differences appears to relate to a person's capability to use proprioceptive feedback to catch a moving object. The explanation for this is that the less experienced, low-skilled person needs visual feedback to assess in the use of proprioceptive feedback to specially position his or her arms and hands and to effectively grasp the object. In terms of helping people improve their catching skill, this relationship between experience and the need for vision of the hands suggests that beginners and less skilled people should practice catching primarily in situations where they can see their hands throughout the ball flight from the point where the ball leaves the thrower's hand until the ball is grasped. And that's all. Thank you for listening.